Welcome back everyone to another episode of The Road Chose Me. I'm Dan Grech, and on today's episode, I'm gonna flip the script. Normally, everyone talks about the 5 things you have to bring overlanding. On today's episode, I'm gonna talk about the 5 things that you shouldn't bring overlanding. So we're all limited by payload, we're all limited by space in our vehicle. We simply can't bring everything, although lots of people do bring a kitchen sink. So what are the 5 things that I've seen people bring that I think are a complete waste of payload and space? Stick around, I'll get into it right now. So item number 1 that I'm gonna say you don't need to bring with you is a welder. And I see this come up all the time. People ask, should I bring some sort of vehicle welder? And I'm just gonna say no, you don't need it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And the first one is, the chances that you're gonna need to weld something are really slim. And yeah, you can come up with a convoluted scenario where it will be necessary, but chances are, if you're driving with vehicle preservation in mind and you're being careful, there's no reason to think that you're gonna break something to such a degree that you have to weld it. And even if you do, there's people in pretty much every village around the world that have some kind of welder. So you're in the middle of nowhere in Guatemala, when I was in the Congo, there are always dudes on the side of the road sticking pieces of steel together with a stick welder. And in fact, when I broke my mirror off when I rolled the Jeep, I found guys on the side of the road in Uganda, they managed to weld the aluminum for me. So all the way around the world, there are guys with welders, and if you really need them, friends of mine had their frame welded after it cracked. Why did their frame crack? Because they had too much stuff. So there are guys who will always weld your stuff. A friend had his drive shaft welded after that snapped. So my advice is you can forget the welder. They use way too much power, they take up too much space, and they're too heavy. And if you're a guy who really loves stacking dimes and you want to practice when you're out there in the Sahara, you can definitely weld with your dual battery setup. So with your jumper leads, bring along a couple of welding rods and the world's smallest welding goggles, and chances are they're going to stay way down in the bottom of your cabinet somewhere and you'll forget you even have them. But if you really feel the need to stick pieces of steel together, I'd go with that option rather than bringing a dedicated welder. The second thing you can forget about bringing on your long overland expedition is a generator. So generators are really big and heavy, and it's just not something that you're gonna need. Of course, your vehicle already has an alternator, so your vehicle itself is already a generator when it's running, and basically every overland build now includes a couple of solar panels, so you have plenty of electricity even if your vehicle won't run. On top of that, they take up lots of space. If you store it inside the vehicle, inevitably it's gonna stink like gas, and that's gonna get inside your living quarters, which is not what you want. If you store it on the outside of the vehicle, the elements are gonna destroy it in no time, and it's just another thing on the outside that curious prying fingers can try and grab at or play with. So a generator is just gonna be so much more hassle than it's worth, and it's definitely not something that I would ever consider bringing with me on a long expedition. The third thing that I recommend against bringing with you on a long-term trip is spare parts that can easily be rebuilt or repaired. So I know it's become really common now in our countries just to replace things when they wear out. Because we have overnight shipping and because parts are relatively cheap, it's really common just to throw away an old part and replace it with a brand new one. And so people assume that this is what you have to do just to fix your car. But it turns out in countries where they don't have overnight shipping and they don't have a ton of extra money, they are really, really efficient at repairing and rebuilding items. So a classic example is a starter motor. Friends of mine had one wear out on their boat in Mexico. We took it to a local garage. The guy spent about 3 hours pulling it down into more parts than I've ever seen a starter motor pulled down to, cleaned it meticulously, put it back together, and he said it'd be good to go for 5 more years. Same story, friends in Mozambique were driving actually the same Jeep as mine, just a bit older, and their alternator wore out. Some guys on the side of the road gave them a ride to a local mechanic. He pulled it down, he put new brushes in it out of some other alternator that he found that fit, put it all back together and drove them back out to their car. The whole thing cost $40, and they've actually been driving on that alternator ever since, even now that they're back in the US. So don't think that you have to bring a ton of spare parts. Think more about which parts can be repaired or rebuilt and go with that option rather than bringing a whole alternator. You're going to save a lot of space and a lot of weight, which is the goal after all. The fourth thing that I see people bring that I really think you can do without is they bring enough food to last an entire month. So I think there's some sort of innate fear there that there won't be food wherever we're going, and people really worry about that. So I've seen people who have enough canned beans and soup and a 10-pound bag of rice, multiple boxes of pasta, they have Mr. Noodle, they have all kinds of non-perishable food that literally they could live on for an entire month. No doubt about it, that stuff is really heavy and it takes up a lot of space, and it just isn't necessary. If you're driving from Alaska to Argentina, every single country has grocery stores just the same as they do in your home country. Even in Africa, most of the countries have grocery stores, or they certainly have, local street markets where they're selling fruit and vegetables and meat. And there are always people on the side of the road selling street food. It's delicious and it's cheap. So obviously, if you're planning to drive the Canning Stock route or cross the Simpson Desert, yes, you need to plan ahead and bring enough food because you're not going to bump into any villages along the way. But if you're driving the Pan American Highway, or if you're driving around Africa like I did, having enough food for a week is usually more than enough. And in fact, every couple of days, it was easy for me to resupply on things that I wanted. On top of that, I much prefer to eat fresh fruit and vegetables rather than just Mr. Noodle every single day. So given the choice, I want to be buying street food and things from street markets anyway. So think long and hard before you pack in too many tins of food and dried goods. They're heavy and you just don't need them. And then the final thing that I see people bring, or that people think about bringing when they're planning a trip, is they try to bring redundant everything. So what do I mean by that? I mean, for example, when I tell people I have an air compressor, which is really handy to have, they say to me, oh, but you should bring a second one in case that first one fails, you'll be stranded without it. Well, yeah, maybe. And then I tell people that I have a fridge. And they say, well, if your fridge fails, you better have some sort of backup. So bring a Yeti cooler and then you could always buy ice as a backup. I say, well, yeah, that'll take up a lot of space. And it goes on and on like this. I tell them I'm a photographer, they say I need a backup camera. This goes so far as people bring an extra camp stove. They bring extra bowls and extra knives and forks, way more than the amount of space in their vehicle would ever allow for people anyway. And I understand this way of thinking that you're going to be stranded without some of these things, but in all reality, it's going to be okay. Even if my camp stove had failed, I could have just gone a few weeks eating bread and avocados and local street food. I'm not going to starve to death without it. If my water pump had failed, I would have found another way. I would have bought bottled water or boiled all my water excessively before drinking it. There's always a solution when one of your small items breaks, and I don't think it's realistic or possible to bring redundant everything. Again, it's just way too much space and way too much payload. So think long and hard before you bring second of anything, and hopefully then you can keep your weight down and stay under payload. Hopefully, fingers crossed. So there you have it. Those are the 5 things that I recommend not bringing when you go on a long-term overland expedition. What do you think about my list? Were you going to bring some of those things? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. While you're there, hit that thumbs up button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. There's always more videos like this coming. Every Monday and Thursday, I'm putting out new content. Let me know down below what you'd like to know about, and I'll make sure I film an episode. So until next time, have fun out there, have lots of adventures. Maybe I'll see you on the road.